The fist hammered against Joseph Lockhart's door before he had even finished latching the cellar hatch beneath his boots, and his heart slammed hard enough that he nearly dropped the lantern. "Lockhart, open up, company business," he knew that voice. Aldous Pratt, foreman of the lower diggings, a man who wore his authority like a brand pressed into other men's skin. Joseph looked down at the trapdoor set into the floorboards of his cabin, at the iron ring bolted through the old oak planks, and at the thing, the person crouched below it in the dark among his sacks of turnips and strings of drying peppers. She had crawled through the gap beneath his cabin's back wall not a quarter-hour before, blood crusted along one green forearm, breathing hard through bared tusks, eyes the color of river ice fixed on him with the wary readiness of something that had been hunted long enough to expect nothing but more hunting. An orc woman, broad-shouldered and lean-muscled beneath travel leathers laced tight to her body, a curved smuggler's blade still gripped white-knuckled in her fist even as she'd pressed herself flat against his cellar wall and gone still as stone. "Please," she had said, and the word had cost her something enormous, he could tell. Orcs did not beg, not to humans. Not ever in his experience of them, which admittedly was not much beyond rumor and old war stories his father used to tell. Now the fist came again, harder. "Lockhart, we know something came through here. Tracks in the mud not 50 yards from your porch, heading straight for your cellar door." Joseph's mind raced through every option and found only one that did not end with her dragged out by her hair and hanged from the gallows post at the center of camp, or worse, handed over to whatever the Blackfang men were offering for her, which by the fear in her eyes was worse than hanging. He grabbed the iron padlock hanging from a nail by the hearth, the one he used for nothing more than securing his tools when he rode down to the trading post, and he knelt and threw the cellar hatch shut. Rasha's eyes went wide in the lantern light below, one hard breath escaping her betrayal, maybe, or terror, he could not tell which, and there was no time to explain. "I'm sorry," he whispered through the boards, fast and low. "Trust me, please." He snapped the padlock through the hasp, twisted the key, and shoved it deep into his coat pocket just as the door of his cabin shuddered under Pratt's fist a third time. Joseph Lockhart crossed his small cabin in 4 strides, opened the door, and stood in the frame with his arms loose at his sides, and his face arranged into the mild, unbothered expression he had spent 6 years learning to wear on the caravan road, where a guard's calm face was worth more than his sword arm most days. "Evening, Pratt," he said. "Something wrong?" Aldous Pratt stood on the porch with 3 men behind him, torches guttering in the mountain wind, breath steaming. He was a thick man running to fat in the belly but still strong through the shoulders, with small eyes that missed very little. "Orc," Pratt said. "A smuggler, one of the Blackfang scum, cut through the tannery fence not an hour gone and put a knife in Duffy's arm when he tried to stop her. We tracked blood halfway to your porch, Lockhart." Joseph kept his voice even. "Tracked it here and then what? You see it go past. Tracks stopped near your woodpile." "Ground's frozen and churned to slush from the mules all day," Joseph said. "Could stop anywhere. I've been in since dusk, splitting kindling and eating my supper. Come in and look if you want." Nothing here but a cold cabin, and a colder root cellar full of turnips. He said it easily, the way a man says a true thing, because he had learned long ago on the wagon roads that a lie told with fear and it was a lie a man could smell. But a lie told the way you tell the truth was a different animal altogether. Pratt's eyes went past him into the cabin, to the modest hearth, the single chair, the narrow cot, and lingered a moment too long on the floorboards where the trapdoor's iron ring caught the torchlight. "That cellar locked?" Pratt asked. "Keeps the frost mice out of my stores," Joseph said. "Company docks my pay if I lose a season's food to vermin, same as it docks yours." One of the other men, younger, restless, shifted his torch. "Let's just look, Pratt. It's freezing out here." Pratt's jaw worked. For one long moment Joseph thought the foreman would push past him regardless, would demand the key, and Joseph did not know, even now, what he would have done if that had happened, whether he would have handed it over and let whatever came, come, or whether some other, More reckless part of him would have stood in that doorway and refused a man who could have him dismissed from the company's employ with a single word to the caravan master. But Pratt only spat over the porch rail into the snow. "If I find out you're hiding Blackfang cargo down there, Lockhart, I'll see you strung up next to it." "Wouldn't dream of it," Joseph said. Pratt turned and stalked off into the dark with his torches bobbing away down the frozen track toward the tannery, and Joseph stood in his open doorway with the wind cutting through his shirt and his heart still hammering, and did not move until the lights had shrunk to nothing among the black pines. Only then did he go back inside, bar the door, and kneel at the trapdoor with shaking hands to fit the key. He was Joseph Lockhart, 29 years old, a caravan guard hired by the Ironvein Mining Company to escort supply wagons up the long, switchbacked road through Widow's Notch to the remote logging and mining camp of Stonehollow, buried deep in the granite folds of the Ashrack Peaks where the snow came early and stayed late, and where a man could go a whole season without a soul asking after him. He had taken the cabin at the camp's edge, nearest the tree line, because it was cheap and because he preferred the quiet, and because 6 winters of escorting wagons through country thick with bandits and worse had taught him that a man who kept to himself rarely got his throat cut in his sleep by someone he trusted too easily. He had never in his life expected to be kneeling on his own cellar hatch with his pulse in his throat, unlocking a door to free an orc woman he had known for less than an hour. He lifted the trapdoor. Rasha Stormbound was already climbing the short ladder before the door had fully opened, moving with the coiled quickness of someone who had spent that whole quarter hour deciding whether the man above her had locked her in a cage or a shelter, and had not been certain until this very moment which it would prove to be. She came up into the lantern light with her blade still in hand, and Joseph took an instinctive step back, and she saw him do it, and something in her hard face flickered, not quite a smile, but close to one. "You locked the door," she said. Her voice was low, roughened, and carried the particular cadence of someone who had learned the common tongue well but had learned it late, each word placed with deliberate care. "From the outside. Didn't want them thinking to check it," Joseph said. "A locked door looks like nothing's worth opening. An unlocked one, they'd have had it up in a heartbeat." She studied him a long moment, ice-pale eyes moving over his face as though reading something written there in a language only she knew. She was taller than him by a hand's width, and he was not a small man, with skin the deep mossy green of pine shadow, and dark hair braided back from a strong, striking face, tusks small and neat where they pressed against her lower lip. Her travel leathers were laced snug from throat to hip, worn soft with hard use, a bandolier of small pouches crossing her chest, and even wounded and hunted she moved like something built for danger and entirely comfortable being so. "You could have opened that door and handed me to them," she said. "Men have handed my kind over for less than a company foreman's good favor." "I'm not most men," Joseph said, and then, feeling foolish at how that sounded, added, "I mean, I don't much care for Pratt, and I don't much care for hanging folk who haven't been given a chance to explain themselves first." "Explain myself." Rasha's mouth curled, not quite bitter, not quite amused. "You want an explanation, human. I want to know why there's a knife wound in your arm and a company foreman calling you Blackfang scum," Joseph said. "And I want to know it before you bleed out on my floor, because that'll be a hell of a thing to explain to the company if they do come back with a warrant to search." That finally won a short huff of breath from her that might have been a laugh. She sat, unbidden, on the edge of his single chair, and let him look at the gash along her forearm, deep, ugly, but not so deep it had caught the artery, and he fetched water and clean cloth and the bottle of spirits he kept for his own aches, and she watched him work with the wary attention of a wolf allowing a hand near its leg, tusks bared not in threat, but in the simple discomfort of the sting when he cleaned the wound. "I run goods through the Notch," she said while he worked. "Not weapons, not slaves, medicine mostly, salt, grain when the company's prices choke the small camps to starving." There are people in the high hollows who'd die of fever before Ironvein's wagons ever reach them with what they need if they reach them at all, and I make sure they get it anyway, whether the company likes the competition or not. That doesn't sound like a hanging offense to most reasonable folk, Joseph said. It is to the ones I used to run with. Her jaw tightened. I was Blackfang once, V-Herc Bloodtusk's crew. We ran everything through these mountains, medicine, yes, but also black powder, stolen ore, worse. When V-Herc decided to start selling rifles to raiders who didn't care whose throats they cut to get them, I told him no. He didn't like being told no. So now V-Herc wants my head on his belt to remind the rest of his crew what happens to those who cross him, and your foreman Pratt wants me hanged to please the company, and between the two of them, I don't have many doors left to knock on. Joseph finished binding the wound and sat back on his heels, looking up at her. In the lantern light, with the fierce readiness gone soft for just a moment around her eyes, she looked less like the legend of terror his father's old war stories had painted, and more like a woman who had been running a very long time and was very tired of it. "You knocked on mine," he said. "Sort of. Crawled under my wall anyway." "Your cellar was the nearest dark hole that didn't have a dog in it," Rasha said, and this time the smile was real, small and sharp and startling in its warmth. "Lucky for me it also didn't have a coward in it." "Don't go calling me lucky yet," Joseph said. "You're still locked in my cabin with half the camp thinking there's Blackfang cargo hiding somewhere close, and there's a mountain pass between us and anywhere safer, and it's going to snow inside the hour. I'd bet good coin on it." He was right. By midnight the wind off the peaks had turned to a driving white wall, and by the next morning Widows notched the only road down out of Stonehollow, the single thread connecting the camp to the lowland towns and the rest of the world, had come down in a roaring collapse of snow and shattered granite that buried 300 yards of switchback under rubble 20 feet deep. No wagon would climb it again before the spring thaw. No one would leave Stonehollow, and no one company man, Blackfang smuggler or fierce orc woman with a price on her head, would be arriving either. Rasha Stormbound was, for better or worse, snowed into Joseph Lockhart's cabin and his life for the whole of the winter to come. The days that followed were a careful, quiet negotiation of space. Joseph slept on a bedroll by the hearth and gave her the cot, though she protested loudly the first night that she was not some fragile thing needing coddling, and he told her plainly that he wasn't coddling her. He was simply not about to make a wounded guest sleep on cold floorboards while he took the bed, and that was the end of the argument, because something in his flat, unbudgeable tone seemed to surprise her into silence more than any amount of arguing would have. She could not be seen. That was the plain, hard fact hanging over every hour of every day. Pratt had not forgotten the tracks in the mud, and word had gone round the camp that a Blackfang smuggler was loose and hiding somewhere close, and men had taken to eyeing every shadow and every stranger's face with fresh suspicion. So Rasha stayed inside through the daylight hours, restless as a caged storm, pacing the small cabin's length until Joseph feared she'd wear a groove into his floor. And only at night, when the snow muffled the world and the camp slept, did she slip out to move her limbs beneath the black pines at the tree line, always with Joseph standing watch at his door, rifleless but with an axe near to hand, more out of habit than any real belief he could stop trouble if it came looking. It was in those small, shared hours that something began, slow and then not slow at all. She was, he learned quickly, nothing at all like the stories. She laughed rarely, but genuinely, a short bark of sound that transformed her whole fierce face, at his terrible attempts to cook stew from the same 6 turnips and salted mule meat he'd been eking out all winter, and she took the ladle from his hand on the 4th night with an exasperated noise, and showed him how her people seasoned meat with crushed juniper berries she carried in one of her bandolier pouches. And the result was, embarrassingly, the best meal he'd eaten in 2 winters. They ate from the same battered iron pot that night, passing a single wooden bowl back and forth between them at his small table, because he owned only the one, And there was something unbearably intimate about that, about her fingers brushing his as the bowl passed, about the way she watched him over its rim with those ice-pale eyes as though daring him to be uncomfortable with how close they now sat. He was not uncomfortable. He was, if he was honest with himself in the dark hours when sleep wouldn't come, something closer to undone. "You stare," she said one evening, not looking up from the blade she was sharpening by the hearthlight, the whetstone hissing along the curved steel in slow, even strokes. "I don't," Joseph said and looked determinedly at the fire. "You do." A faint smile touched her mouth. "Humans think orcs cannot tell when they are being watched. It is one of many foolish things humans think." "What else do humans think that's foolish?" She considered this, turning the blade to catch the firelight. "That we are all raiders. That we cannot love gently, only fight fiercely. That any orc kindness is a trick before a killing blow." Her eyes flicked up to his, steady and unflinching. "You have not thought any of those things about me, not once that I have seen. Would you have let me keep thinking them if I had?" "No," Rasha said simply. "I would have left the moment the snow allowed it and never troubled you again. I do not stay where I am not wanted, Joseph Lockhart. I have never had to." The way she said his full name, deliberate, careful, as though she liked the shape of it in her mouth, did something to his chest that he had no ready word for. "You're wanted," he said before he could stop himself, and then, feeling the heat climb his neck, added, "You're welcome here is what I meant to say." Rasha set down the whetstone. She rose, unfolding to her full height in the small cabin, and crossed the few feet between them, and Joseph's heart climbed into his throat as she stopped close enough that he had to tip his head back to hold her gaze. "Say the first thing," she said quietly, "not the second." He swallowed. "You're wanted. I want you here. That's the truth of it, and I don't rightly know what to do with wanting an orc woman I've known less than a fortnight, but there it is." She looked at him for a long, considering moment, the fire popping softly behind her, and then she reached out and laid one broad, calloused hand against his jaw, tilting his face up further, and kissed him. It was not gentle, not at first. There was too much banked fire in her for gentle, too many weeks of running and fighting, and being hunted for her to know how to be soft with anything. And Joseph met that fierceness with his own hands rising to her waist, to the laced leather warm from the hearth, and for a long, breathless moment the cabin and the snow and Pratt and Verherk Bloodtusk and the whole buried world beyond that door simply ceased to exist. When she finally drew back, forehead resting against his, her breath came unsteady, and for the first time since he'd met her, Rasha Stormbound looked something like uncertain. "That is not how I intended tonight to go," she admitted. "I'm not complaining," Joseph said, a little breathless himself. "No," she said, and the fierce smile came back, softer now. "I do not imagine you are." The weeks wore on. The snow held, deep and unbroken, and Stonehollow settled into the long grind of a mountain winter, men splitting logs and hauling ore from the shallow diggings that could still be worked despite the cold, women mending nets and boiling tallow for candles, children racing sleds down the frozen slope behind the mess hall while their breath hung white in the air. Joseph kept to his usual duties, walking the camp's perimeter at dusk, checking the palisade fence the company had thrown up 2 winters back after a bad raid, standing his watches. But every night he came home to a cabin that no longer felt empty, to Rasha waiting with something cooking or something sharpened, or, more than once, simply waiting with her boots up on his one chair, and an expression that made his tired body forget every ache of the day. She told him more of herself in those weeks than he suspected she had told anyone in years. She had been born in a war camp in the Eastern Highlands, one of the Stormbound clan, a lineage that had once been proud and numerous before a war 2 generations back had scattered them thin across the mountains. She had run with Verherk's Blackfang crew for 6 years, first because it fed her and gave her purpose, and then, as the crew's dealings turned darker and darker, because leaving felt impossible. Until the night she'd watched Verherk sell a crate of rifles to a raiding band that used them, 3 weeks later, to burn a lowland farmstead to the ground with a family still inside it. She had taken what medicine and grain she could carry, and she had run. And she had been running for the better part of 2 years since, funneling what goods she could to camps and hollows the company overcharged or ignored outright. Always one step ahead of Vherk's bounty, and one step ahead of men like Pratt who saw only the word smuggler and reached for a rope. "You could have kept running," Joseph said one night, low, both of them sitting close by the banked fire, her head resting against his shoulder in a way that had become, without either of them quite marking the moment it started, entirely natural. "Instead of stopping here." "I did not choose to stop here," Rasha said. "The mountain chose that when it buried the road." "But you're not running now that you could," he said. "The pass will clear eventually. You could slip out before anyone's the wiser." She was quiet a long moment, and when she spoke again her voice had gone unusually careful. "I have run from every place I have ever called home, Joseph. Every crew, every clan, every hollow I hid in too long. I am very good at running." She tilted her head to look up at him. "I do not want to run from this one." He kissed her then, slow this time, unhurried, and if the cabin walls could have spoken they would have said that this was the night something between them stopped being a question and became instead a fact, quiet and certain as the mountain itself. But quiet certainty, in a camp full of frightened, cold, suspicious people, could not last forever buried under snow. It was Bram Duffy, a broad, graying camp guard who had taken a shine to Joseph over the winter, and who Joseph counted the closest thing to a friend Stonehollow had given him, who first spotted her, a shape at Joseph's window in the gray dawn light, moving with an unmistakable, unhurried grace that no human woman in camp possessed. Bram said nothing that day, weighing his loyalty to Joseph against his duty to the camp, but 3 days later, over cards in the mess hall, half drunk on the thin beer the cook brewed from mountain barley, he let something slip to the wrong man, and by evening the whole of Stonehollow knew that Joseph Lockhart had been hiding an orc in his cabin through the whole of the long winter. The camp meeting was called in the mess hall the following night, every lantern lit, every soul in Stonehollow packed shoulder to shoulder along the long tables and against the walls, breath steaming in air gone thick with fear and fury both. Joseph stood near the door with his heart a stone in his chest, and beside him, because she had refused flatly to hide any longer while he faced this alone, stood Rasha Stormbound, chin high, hand resting loose and ready near the curved blade at her hip. Aldous Pratt stood at the front of the hall, and beside him stood Otto Kessler, the camp's aging overseer, a fair man by most accounts but one whose fairness had never before been tested against something so raw as this. "She's Blackfang," Pratt shouted, before Kessler could even open the meeting properly, jabbing a thick finger toward Rasha. "Everyone here knows what that means. Vherk Bloodtusk's whole crew is out there somewhere in these mountains, and I'd wager my last coin they know exactly where their runaway is holed up, which means they know exactly where Stonehollow sits. She's led them right to our door, and Lockhart's hidden her the whole while like some company traitor." "I've led no one anywhere," Rasha said, her voice carrying clear and hard over the crowd's rising murmur. "I fled Vherk's crew 2 years past. If he finds this camp, it will be because his scouts are better than you credit them, not because of any word from me." "And why should we believe a smuggler's word?" someone shouted from the crowd. "Because I have given your camp no reason to distrust it," Rasha said, "and every reason to distrust the man standing next to your overseer instead, who has hated my kind since before he ever laid eyes on me." Pratt's face went dark red. "You hear that, Kessler? Threatening a foreman right here in the hall." "I threatened no one," Rasha said, unmoved. "I stated a fact." The hall had begun to churn, voices rising against each other, fear feeding fear the way it always did in a crowd too long cooped up under snow with too little to occupy its worry, and Joseph felt the whole room tipping toward something ugly and irreversible. He stepped forward, one hand raised. "She's saved this camp trouble already," he said, pitching his voice to carry. She knows the smuggler paths through these mountains better than any scout the company's ever hired. If Blackfang is out there, she's the reason we'll see them coming before they see us. Or the reason they'll walk right through our fence line without a shot fired, Pratt snarled. And then, before Joseph fully understood what was happening, before the words had even finished registering, Pratt's hand had gone to his belt and come away with a long skinning knife, and he was lunging not at Rasha, whose blade was half-drawn before he'd covered half the distance, but past her at Joseph, who stood unarmed and startled in the crowded hall. "You've been playing us for fools all winter, Lockhart, hiding company enemies under your own roof." The blade came in low and fast, aimed at Joseph's ribs, and there was no time to think, only to move, and Rasha Stormbound moved. She threw herself bodily between them, catching Pratt's knife arm at the wrist with one hand, even as her own momentum carried her chest first into the path of the blade. And for one horrifying, frozen instant the whole hall seemed to hold its breath as steel scraped along leather and flesh both. A shallow line opening along her upper arm, where the knife's edge caught before her grip wrenched Pratt's wrist hard enough to crack, and the blade spun free and clattered against the floorboards. The hall erupted. Someone screamed. Two of Pratt's fellow foremen surged forward to grab Rasha, and Joseph, heart thundering, threw himself in turn between her and them, catching a wild swing on his shoulder that would have taken her in the face, staggering but not falling, his own fists coming up now, every ounce of caravan road training in his body suddenly awake and ready. Enough! Otto Kessler's voice cracked across the hall like a whip, and the old overseer shoved his way between the tangled bodies with a strength that belied his years, physically wedging himself between Pratt's men and the two of them. "Enough, damn you all. Anyone who throws another blow in my hall answers to me." Silence fell, ragged and shaking. Pratt clutched his wrist, cursing. Rasha stood with blood welling along the shallow cut on her arm, her chest heaving, eyes locked on Pratt with an expression that promised violence deferred rather than violence forgotten. Joseph's shoulder throbbed where the blow had landed, but he had eyes only for her, for the blood on her sleeve, for the fact that she had thrown her body into the path of a knife meant for him without a moment's hesitation. "She saved him," someone said into the ringing, quiet Bram Duffy's voice, guilt-roughened, cutting through the crowd's uncertain murmur. "I saw it plain. Pratt went for Lockhart and she took the blade meant for him." Kessler looked between them all, Pratt nursing his wrist, Rasha bleeding, Joseph standing protectively at her shoulder, the whole hall of frightened, watching faces, and something in the old overseer's expression shifted, the fear giving ground just slightly to something more like shame. "Anyone raises a blade in this hall again without my say," Kessler said, low and hard, "answers to me, company foreman or not." He turned to Rasha. "You've a wound needs tending." "And you," his gaze found Pratt, "will keep your knife sheathed and your mouth shut until I've had time to think on what's owed for tonight." The crowd began slowly, uncertainly to disperse, though the whispers followed them out into the cold like smoke, and Joseph knew, watching them go, that the camp's fear of Rasha had not vanished, but something else had entered it now, something that had not been there before. Doubt. And beneath the doubt, however grudging, the first thread of respect. He walked her home through the dark, his arm around her shoulders, and once inside with the door barred and the fire built back up, he tended the shallow cut on her arm with hands that would not quite stop trembling, and she watched him work with an expression he had not seen on her before, something unguarded, something that looked almost like wonder. "You would have taken that blade," she said quietly. "I saw it in your face. You would have let it take you rather than let it reach me." "Didn't have time to think it through," Joseph admitted. "Just moved." "That is not nothing," Rasha said. "Men do not move like that for things they do not love, Joseph Lockhart." He looked up from the bandage, startled by the word, by the plain, unguarded way she'd said it, no hedging, no softening. "Is that what this is?" he asked, hardly daring to. "Love." "I have fought duels," Rasha said. "I have run from clan bounties and outrun Vherk's whole crew through blizzards that would have killed lesser fighters. I do not frighten easily, human. But I have never in my life thrown myself into a blade's path for anyone before tonight, and I did not think, and I would do it again without thinking 100 times more. She reached out and took his face in both her broad hands, careful of the bandage still binding one arm. Yes, that is what this is. I love you. It is inconvenient and it is dangerous and I do not care. Joseph did not trust himself to speak. He simply pulled her close instead, careful of her wound, and held her, and felt her arms come around him in turn, fierce and certain. And in the small warm circle of that cabin, with the snow still deep outside and the whole camp's fear still simmering beyond the door, he let himself believe, for the first time in a long, lonely life, that he was wanted truly, fiercely, entirely wanted, by someone who could have chosen anyone and had chosen him. That night with the fire burned low and the wind hushed outside, the last careful distance between them fell away. There was nothing hurried in it now, nothing born of fear or desperation, only two people who had found, against every likelihood the world had offered them, something neither meant to let go of again. Later in the dark, her head against his chest and his hand tracing slow, unhurried patterns along the strong line of her shoulder, Rasha spoke against his skin, quiet as a confession. "Among my people," she said, "there is a custom. When a warrior chooses a mate, she offers her blade not to use but to be held. It says, 'I trust you with the thing that has kept me alive. I have never offered mine to anyone.'" Joseph turned his head to look at her in the near dark. "Are you offering it to me?" "Not yet," she said, and he could hear the smile in her voice even without seeing it. "Survive what is coming with me first, Joseph Lockhart, then ask me again." He did not have to wait long to learn what was coming. It began 3 days later with Bram Duffy pounding on Joseph's door at first light, breath ragged from running, face gray with more than cold. "Riders," Bram gasped. Coming down through the high trail past the old watchtower ruin, a dozen at least, maybe more behind. Kessler's calling every able body to the palisade. Rasha was on her feet before Joseph had fully processed the words, already reaching for her blade, her face gone hard and focused in a way he had not seen since that first frantic night in his cellar. "V. Herc," she said, certain as stone. "That is his crew's approach, that exact trail. He has found me." The camp came alive in a scramble of shouted orders and running feet. Men grabbing axes and the handful of old spears the company kept stored against exactly this eventuality. Women herding children toward the mine's deepest tunnels for shelter. Kessler's voice booming across the compound, organizing what defense could be scraped together from loggers and miners never trained for battle. Joseph ran for the palisade with his sword, the one weapon he'd carried faithfully through 6 winters on the caravan road, already in hand. Rasha at his side, matching his pace stride for stride. "How many will he bring?" Joseph asked, breathless. "Enough," Rasha said grimly. "Enough to think a snowbound logging camp an easy prize. He does not know Stonehollow has defenders who know his own roots as well as he does." They reached the palisade's gate just as the first riders crested the rise beyond the tree line. Not a dozen but nearer 30, dark shapes against the snow, weapons catching the pale morning light. At their head rode a huge orc on a heavy mountain pony, tusks longer and more battle-scarred than Rasha's, a black cloak snapping in the wind behind him. "V. Herc," Rasha breathed. Kessler, standing atop the palisade's makeshift watch platform with what few armed men the camp could muster arrayed behind the fence, called down. "That's your old crew, girl. Tell me plain, can we hold this fence, or should I be sending every soul I've got down into the mine tunnels right now?" "You can hold it," Rasha called back, "if you listen to me instead of your fear for the next quarter hour." She turned to Joseph, eyes blazing with a fierce, terrible clarity. "There is a smuggler's cut through the rock behind the tannery, an old drainage tunnel Viherk's crew has used before to flank fortified camps. He will send half his riders round to hit that flank while the front assault holds our attention here at the main gate. If we do not block that tunnel, Stonehollow falls no matter how well this fence holds." Kessler did not hesitate. Lockhart, take her and whoever you need. Bram with them. The rest of you hold this gate. They ran, the three of them and four more men Bram gathered on the way, cutting through the camp's narrow lanes toward the tannery and the black mouth of the drainage tunnel beyond it, boots slipping on packed snow, breath tearing at their lungs. They reached the tunnel's mouth with perhaps 2 minutes to spare before the first Blackfang riders came pouring down the narrow defile toward it, exactly as Rasha had predicted. What followed was chaos rendered into something like order only by Rasha's cold, practiced command. She directed men to fell 2 waiting logs across the tunnel mouth, had others pile loose rubble and frozen barrels of tannery lime behind the makeshift barricade. And when the first riders hit that barrier at a gallop, the resulting tangle of screaming ponies and thrown riders bought the defenders precious minutes to fall into a rough fighting line. Joseph fought at Rasha's shoulder in a blur of motion he would only half remember afterward, the clash of his sword against a raider's axe, the press of bodies in the narrow tunnel mouth, Bram's roaring bellow as he swung a felling axe two-handed into the melee. Rasha fought like something out of the old war stories after all, but there was nothing monstrous in it, only a fierce, controlled fury, her curved blade finding gaps in armor with terrible precision, her free hand catching and turning aside blows meant for the men fighting beside her, for Joseph most of all. He realized dimly, even in the chaos, she was angling her body again and again to keep the worst of the fighting turned toward herself and away from him. Then Viherk himself came through the broken barricade, having abandoned the main gate assault when word reached him his flanking force had stalled, and the huge orc's cold eyes found Rasha across the churned, bloody snow. "Stormbound," Viherk snarled, "you have cost me 2 years of hunting and I am done being patient." "Then stop hunting," Rasha said, blade steady in her hand, "and go home, Viherk. You have already lost more men here than this camp is worth to you." He came at her with a war axe and a blow that would have split a lesser fighter in two, and she met it, steel ringing against steel. And for a long, terrible moment the fight around them seemed to fall away, as the 2 former crewmates traded blows with a speed and ferocity that left Joseph's chest tight with fear he had no way to act on. He was no match for Viherk's raw strength. He knew that plainly, and any interference now might only get Rasha killed defending him instead of herself. So he did the only thing left to do. He shouted to Bram, and together they turned their attention to the raiders still pressing through the tunnel's flanks, cutting down the press of lesser fighters, buying Rasha the clear space she needed, trusting her fiercely, completely, to do what he could not. It was a misstep on Viherk's part in the end that decided it, a heavy overhead swing that Rasha ducked beneath, driving her shoulder into his chest and her blade up under his ribs in the same motion, and the huge orc staggered back with a roar of pain and fury, his axe falling from a suddenly weakened grip. Rasha did not press the killing blow. She stood over him, chest heaving, blade steady at his throat, and said something low in the orcish tongue that Joseph did not understand but that made every remaining Blackfang rider within earshot immediately lower their weapons. "Go," Rasha said, in the common tongue now, loud enough for all to hear. "Tell what remains of your crew that Rasha Stormbound is done running from you. The next time you come for me, I will not let you crawl away." Viherk, bleeding and beaten, gathered what remained of his scattered raiders and withdrew back up the defile the way they had come. And by the time the sun had climbed fully over the eastern ridge, Stonehollow stood battered but unbroken, its fence line littered with the aftermath of a fight that had, against every fearful whisper in the mess hall 3 nights before, been won in no small part by the very woman half the camp had wanted hanged. Joseph found Rasha sitting on an overturned barrel near the tunnel mouth in the fight's aftermath, blade still bloody in her lap, staring at nothing in particular, and when he sat beside her she leaned her head against his shoulder without a word, and they simply breathed together in the cold, bright morning for a long, quiet while. "You could have killed him," Joseph said eventually. "I could have," Rasha agreed. But I did not want to carry that with me forever, when running was enough to be free of him. She looked up at Joseph then, something raw and open in her tired face. I did not fight for this camp today, Joseph. I want you to know that plainly. I fought for you. Every blow, every choice. It was you I was thinking of, not Stonehollow, not the company, not even myself. You. Word of the battle spread through the camp within hours, and with it, inevitably, the truth of what Rasha had done, not just the tunnel defense that had saved half the camp's fighting strength for the main gate, but the knife blow taken for Joseph in the crowded hall days before. Both stories now told and retold with a very different weight than Pratt's accusations had carried. Otto Kessler himself came to Joseph's cabin that evening, hat in hand, an unusual humility in his weathered face. "I owe you both an apology," Kessler said to Rasha directly, which surprised her visibly. "I let fear speak louder than sense, and near got a good man killed, and a good woman hanged for it. Stonehollow owes you a debt it can't easily repay, but I mean to see this camp try." Pratt, for his part, was quietly dismissed from his foreman's post within the week. The camp's council hastily formed in the fight's aftermath, with Bram Duffy among its new members having little patience left for a man who had nearly gotten his neighbor killed over prejudice dressed up as caution. Joseph heard, secondhand, that Pratt left Stonehollow entirely once the spring thaw finally opened Widow's Notch again, taking the first supply wagon south and never looking back. The winter that followed the battle was, against every hard thing that had come before it, the gentlest season of Joseph Lockhart's adult life. Rasha no longer hid through the daylight hours. She walked openly through Stonehollow's lanes, and though not every eye that followed her was warm, enough of them had softened into something like acceptance that she no longer flinched at the attention. She took to helping at the tannery, where her knowledge of curing hides in the old clan fashion proved unexpectedly valuable, and to teaching a handful of the camp's younger guards knife work in the evenings. And slowly, camp by lane by conversation, Stonehollow came to know her not as the smuggler the rumors had painted, but as the woman who had bled to save a man in a crowded hall and fought to save a camp full of strangers who had, at first, wanted her dead. Joseph watched all of it with a quiet, constant wonder that never quite faded, watched her laugh with Bram's wife over some shared joke about mule-headed husbands, watched children who had once run screaming at the sight of an orc now clustering around her at the mess hall fire, to hear stories of the high mountain passes and the strange creatures that dwelled there, and felt, each time, that particular ache of gratitude that comes from watching someone you love be truly seen at last by a world that had refused for too long to look. It was on a clear night near the height of that second winter, the stars sharp and close above the Ashrek peaks, that Rasha led him out past the palisade fence to the tree line where they had first walked together in secret so many months before, and there, in the same quiet dark, she drew her curved smuggler's blade from its sheath and held it out to him, hilt first, across both open palms. "I told you once," she said, "that among my people a warrior offers her blade to the one she chooses as mate. Not to use, to hold, to trust." Her ice-pale eyes, steady in the starlight, held his without wavering. "I am offering mine to you now, Joseph Lockhart. You have held it already without ever touching the steel. You held it the night you locked a door to keep me safe from men who would have killed me, and you have held it every day since. I would have that be more than a debt owed. I would have it be a life shared." Joseph took the blade from her hands with a reverence he had never felt for any object in his life, and set it aside carefully in the snow, and then took her hands in both of his instead, calloused palm against calloused palm. "I don't have a warrior's blade to offer back," he said, voice rough. "All I've got is a caravan guard sword that's seen more mud than glory, and a cabin that's colder than it ought to be most winters, and a heart that's been yours, I think, since about the second night you were locked in my cellar shouting through the floorboards that you weren't some fragile thing needing coddling." Rasha laughed, bright and unguarded, the sound carrying clear across the snow-hushed dark. "I remember that shouting. I'll take a sword over a smuggler's blade any day of my life. Joseph went on, "if it means I get to spend the rest of my winters with you in that cold cabin, learning to season mule meat with juniper berries and losing every argument you decide to have with me." "You do not lose every argument," Rasha said, mock offended. "I lose most of them. Most is not every." She was smiling now fully, the fierce, guarded warrior entirely gone from her face, replaced by something soft and radiant that made Joseph's chest ache with how much he loved her. "Is this your way of saying yes, Joseph Lockhart?" "This is my way of saying yes," Joseph said, 100 times over for as long as you'll have me." She kissed him then, there beneath the stars with her blade lying forgotten in the snow beside them. And when she drew back she was laughing again, wiping unexpected wetness from her own eyes with the back of one broad hand, a gesture so unguarded and human. Despite everything she was, everything she had survived, every fierce and terrible battle behind her, that Joseph felt his own throat tighten with the weight of it. They were married that spring, once the last snows had finally cleared from Widow's Notch, and the wagons could climb the mountain road again, in a ceremony that blended, awkwardly and beautifully, both their worlds. Otto Kessler stood as witness on the company's behalf, reading the simple vows Stonehollow's own settlers used for their unions, while Bram Duffy stood grinning at Joseph's shoulder as the nearest thing he had to family in that camp. But it was Rasha's custom that gave the day its true weight. She and Joseph stood together before the gathered camp, forearms bared to the mountain air, and with the very blade she had offered him beneath the stars, she drew a shallow line across her own palm. And then, with the same care she had shown tending his shoulder after Pratt's knife had caught him in the crowded hall, across his a small, deliberate cut, no deeper than the wound she'd once taken for him, and pressed her palm to his so the blood mingled between them, an old clan rite of binding that had not been performed by a Stormbound in 2 generations, she told him later, and that she had never once expected to perform. Herself, blood to blood, she said, loud enough for the gathered camp to hear, storm to shelter. I, Rasha Stormbound, claim this man as mine before all who witness it, in war and in peace, for every winter left to us. The whole of Stonehollow miners and loggers, women and children, guards who had once eyed her with suspicion, and now watched with nothing but warmth, erupted into cheering that echoed off the granite peaks around them. And Joseph Lockhart, standing with his palm pressed to hers and his whole overlooked, ordinary life finally, impossibly, made extraordinary by the fierce and magnificent woman who had chosen him above every other path open to her, laughed and wept both at once, and could not remember, in that bright mountain morning, ever once in his life having felt so thoroughly, so completely, so unshakably loved.